Before we cross the ocean toward the African coast, we need to understand the backdrop from which the first ships departed. Late medieval Europe was a fragmented continent, drowning in territorial wars, plagues, famine, and religious conflicts. Kings fought over land, feudal lords waged local battles, and the common people barely survived. It was a time of fear and darkness, but also of ambition and a thirst for change. In the south of this continent, a small kingdom stood out: Portugal. Nestled between the rising power of Spain and the still unknown Atlantic, Portugal had something others envied: direct access to the sea and a nobility willing to invest in something new. The country was young, recently affirmed as an independent kingdom, and needed to prove its worth. Expanding its borders westward and southward wasn't just a dream, it was a matter of survival and power. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church held not only spiritual power, but political control as well. It was the Church that blessed kings, approved wars and sanctioned conquests. In the name of faith, much was done, including enslavement. The idea of converting the infidels justified everything. Christians saw themselves as bearers of truth and therefore felt entitled to dominate those who thought differently. This was the seed of a discourse that would feed centuries of domination and violence. The world known to Europeans ended shortly after the Mediterranean Sea. Africa was a mystery, surrounded by legends. People spoke of immensely wealthy kingdoms, golden cities and exotic merchants, but there was also fear. Fear of impassable deserts, wild animals and barbaric tribes. As always, ignorance gave birth to monsters, and monsters justified conquest. Within that context, a motivation even stronger than religion began to emerge: profit. The scarcity of labor, high production costs, and the desperate need for wealth to support armies and royal courts pushed European kingdoms beyond their limits. The world had to be discovered, explored, and dominated. It was the era of gold, salt, spices, and soon it would also become the era of human flesh. Portugal understood this before anyone else. While others were still fighting over castles, the Portuguese were building caravels. While kings disputed thrones, Prince Henry the Navigator was collecting maps, hiring cartographers, and calling on sailors to chart routes southward. It was the beginning of European maritime expansion, and Portugal was at the forefront. But these men weren't moved by curiosity or faith alone. They were driven by the promise of wealth, of slaves, of domination. At the heart of this movement was the belief that some peoples were inherently inferior. The skin color, customs, religion, everything was used as justification to dehumanize, and once dehumanized, the other could be treated as merchandise. This mindset didn't arise from nowhere. It was carefully cultivated over centuries, fueled by religious rhetoric, pseudoscience, and economic interests. The Portuguese nobility saw an opportunity. And when the first group of captured Africans arrived on the shores of Portugal in the mid-15th century, the cycle was sealed. They were displayed in public, sold in town squares, paraded like exotic goods from distant lands. That scene, still limited to the Portuguese kingdom at the time, would soon be replicated thousands of times in different languages, ports, and continents. Portugal was, little by little, building a model, a system, and this system would become the foundation for the largest and most brutal trade of human lives in world history. Slavery didn't begin with Portugal, but it was Portugal that organized it, profited from it, and exported its model to the rest of the world. And to understand how that happened, we must go back to the very beginning, because what came next wasn't an accident. It was a project. And that project began with Prince Henry and his ambition to turn Portugal into the first global power. He wasn't a king. He never fought in war. and yet his influence stretched across centuries. Prince Henry the Navigator was the mastermind behind the first major European maritime expansion project, and inevitably behind the first institutionalized African enslavement system in Europe. The son of King João I, Henry was given the title of Infante and governed the Algarve region in southern Portugal. But his gaze was far beyond the land. It was the sea that fascinated him. In the first half of the 15th century, Henry established a nautical study center in the town of Sagres, gathering cartographers, astronomers, sailors, and engineers. The School of Sagres, as it became known, wasn't a university in the formal sense, but it was a convergence point of science, ambition, and faith. There, maps were redrawn, routes calculated, stars observed, all with a single goal: to reach the unknown. And with one very clear interest: to find wealth and expand the Christian faith. The first coastal expeditions headed toward North Africa, especially the area of modern-day Morocco. The conquest of the city of Ceuta in 1415 was symbolic. It not only marked Portugal's entry into the era of overseas expansion, but it also offered a preview of what was to come: contact with the African trade of gold, spices, and slaves. Because yes, even before Europeans, there were systems of slavery within the African continent, but they served different social and cultural functions, very different from the racial and mercantile slavery that Portugal would soon help create. Prince Henry saw an opportunity. If Africans were already trading prisoners of war among themselves, why not enter that market and expand it? In a short time, expeditions began moving down the African Atlantic coast, establishing contact with various peoples and kingdoms. At first, exchanges were made with gifts, weapons, fabrics, and European objects in return for gold, ivory, and people. But this tone of negotiation would soon give way to coercion, violence, and outright kidnapping. In 1441, one of the expeditions led by Antão Gonçalves and Nuno Tristão returned to Portugal with the first Africans captured by force. They were presented to Prince Henry as a gift and quickly sold in Lagos. From that moment on, human trafficking stopped being incidental or secondary. It became a goal in itself. It's important to understand that at that time, Portugal did not see these actions as immoral. Quite the opposite. The Church legitimized the enslavement of infidels, and Pope Nicholas V even issued the papal bull Dum Diversas in 1452, officially authorizing the Portuguese kings to conquer and enslave all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ. It was a sacred license to transform exploitation into salvation and pain into profit. The sale of Africans began to intensify. Lisbon and Lagos became centers for the trade of people. Men, women, and children were taken to the ports, displayed like merchandise, and sold in public squares. They were given Christian names, branded with hot irons, and subjected to a process of domestication before being sent off to work as servants, rowers, or domestic laborers. But this was only the beginning. The Portuguese crown quickly realized the potential of this trade. It began issuing licenses and monopolies to merchants who wanted to participate in the new enterprise. It is in return, those merchants paid high taxes to the monarchy. In other words, the state profited directly from every human body sold. The trafficking of Africans became officially a national business. And it wasn't just any business. The enslaved represented a practical solution to several problems facing the Portuguese nobility: the shortage of labor, the expansion of sugar plantations on the Atlantic islands, such as Madeira and Cape Verde, and increased production without relying on free peasants. With this, Portugal established the model that years later would be exported to Brazil and later imitated by Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands. It is painful to say, but necessary. Portugal was the laboratory of modern slavery. It tested methods, developed routes, created laws, normalized horror, And all of this was done under a varnish of glory, faith, and progress. The caravels that left the Tagus River bound for Africa sailed under the blessing of priests. Departure ceremonies included prayers, vows, and celebrations. But upon reaching the African coast, these ships became instruments of destruction. Where there had once been trade, now there was plunder. Where there had been alliances, fear took root. Where there had been humanity, Portugal planted dehumanization, and thus slowly the Portuguese slave project was born. A project built on three pillars: God, gold, and slaves. It was not a historical accident, it was a well-executed plan, and that plan was just beginning. As Portuguese ships moved down the African coast, a new kind of structure began to appear along the shores of the unknown: the Faitorias. More than just trading posts, they became the first pillars of European domination on African soil. These were strategic fortresses, protected by cannons and soldiers, which served as depots for storing goods and soon for confining human beings. These Faitorias were not initially built by force. In many cases, they arose from agreements with local leaders who saw the Portuguese as opportunities for trade and alliances against rival kingdoms. The first interactions were marked by exchanges: mirrors, fabrics, weapons, horses, and wine in return for gold, ivory, pepper, and eventually, people. The Portuguese used diplomacy when it suited them. They sent ambassadors, offered gifts, learned local dialects, and promised friendship and protection. Many tribal chiefs, in turn, believed they were forging cooperative agreements, not realizing they were opening the gates to a dominance that would only grow. Over time, the Faitorias became permanent points of European presence. Some of the most well-known, like São Jorge da Mina in present-day Ghana, built in 1482, became true colonial fortresses, surrounded by high walls, watchtowers, underground warehouses, and most shockingly damp, dark cells where the enslaved awaited boarding. Many of them spent days or weeks confined there, not knowing where they would be taken, or if they would ever see the light of day again. The process was meticulous. Captured Africans, whether through tribal wars, betrayal, or outright kidnappings, were brought to the Faitorias and evaluated. Strong men, young women, and healthy children were worth more. The sick, elderly, and injured were discarded like defective goods. There were ledger books, bodily marks, and detailed control systems. Slavery was no longer improvised. It was becoming bureaucracy. And with that, the logic of alliances also changed. If once the Portuguese relied on the goodwill of local leaders, now they began to use force. When a kingdom refused to cooperate, the cannons spoke. The Faitorias ceased to be mere trading posts and became military bases for silent invasion. The African map began to be redrawn under the orders of the Cross and the Crown. The forced alliances also gained a new layer: religion. Missionaries accompanied commercial missions and built churches next to the Faitorias. The idea was clear: where trade entered, faith should enter too. Many Africans were baptized by force before being taken onto ships, as if the rite could erase their culture, their beliefs, their identity. It was the spiritualization of domination. The trade also deeply altered the relationships between African peoples themselves. Rival tribes began capturing each other to sell to the Portuguese. Entire kingdoms specialized in this commerce. European weapons provided by the Lusitanians fueled local wars, wars that were intentionally provoked to increase the supply of captives. Portugal manipulated, divided, and conquered without needing large armies. In just a few decades, what began as occasional trade became a system that undermined African autonomy, destabilized millennia-old cultures, and rewrote the balance of power across the continent. The Faitorias also served as training centers for new European merchants. There, they learned how to deal with tribal chiefs, how to organize capture expeditions, how to store enslaved people, and even how to calculate profits per head. It was a full-blown course on how to turn lives into profit. And we cannot ignore the human element. Many Portuguese who took part in these practices left written accounts, ship logs, letters to the crown, administrative records. In their words, Africans were goods, fine quality blacks, pieces of living ivory. The language reveals more than just numbers. It reveals the total loss of empathy, the erasure of another person's soul. Men and women became statistics. Meanwhile, in Portugal, the people applauded the wealth that arrived. Gold, sugar, and now, human lives. Slavery was still restricted to noble and mercantile circles, but its impact was already being felt. The country grew, prospered, at the cost of African blood. The African Faitorias were therefore more than physical structures. They were the first laboratories of the Atlantic slave trade. It was in them that the methods, the narratives, and the strategies were tested. Strategies that would later be exported to Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. It all began there, stone by stone, cell by cell, chain by chain. What happened within those walls would shape the centuries that followed. It was the beginning of a cruel, precise, profitable, and above all, planned machine. What initially seemed like a series of occasional trade exchanges slowly turned into a meticulously constructed system. Portugal wasn't just trafficking human beings. Portugal organized, legalized, and normalized the entire process. Slavery became state policy. And with that, a machine was assembled, cold, efficient, and ruthless. At the center of this system stood the Portuguese crown. From the time of Prince Henry through King João II and King Manuel I, the monarchy understood that the trafficking of Africans was one of the fastest routes to wealth and international prestige. Just as there were taxes on salt, wine, and spices, there now existed a royal tax for each enslaved person transported. It was the institutionalized profit of pain. Portugal implemented contracts and concessions authorizing certain trading groups to operate routes and trading posts in exchange for fixed tributes to the crown. These were known as royal commercial monopolies. In other words, the state outsourced the capture and sale of people, but collected its share. No African crossed the Atlantic without generating revenue for Lisbon. During this period, Lisbon's port became one of the largest slave markets in Europe. African men and women were brought in by the thousands and sold at public auctions as if they were animals. They were displayed naked, inspected by their teeth, muscles, eyes, and wounds. Children cried in silence. Mothers were separated from their children. Young men were chained together. It was a macabre spectacle, but a common one. And more than that, there were rules. Regulations dictated how the enslaved should be transported, how much space they could occupy on ships, how many liters of water they were entitled to each week. Not out of humanity, but out of interest. The more survivors at the end of the voyage, the greater the profit. Slavery became a science of exploitation. Portuguese ships were equipped with iron grates, chains embedded in the lower deck, and rudimentary ventilation systems. The Atlantic journey, which could last between 40 and 60 days, was a torture chamber. People were crammed into filthy holds with so little space that they could barely move. Many defecated on themselves. Disease spread. The smell was unbearable. Death was constant, and yet the profits were so high that the loss of life was considered a natural part of the process. Even if 20 or 30% died during the voyage, the profit was still guaranteed. It was a trade that accepted genocide as an operational expense. Those who survived were taken not only to Lisbon, but also to the Portuguese colonies. The islands of Madeira, Azores, Cape Verde, and later Brazil became agricultural production centers entirely dependent on enslaved labor. Sugar cultivation in particular demanded physical strength, endurance, and discipline, everything the slave owners expected to extract by force from the Africans. In Brazil, the logic of slavery was even more radical. The sugar mills were true concentration camps. The landowners used whips, hot irons, stocks, and chains to control the captives. Any sign of rebellion was punished with mutilation or death. Fear was the tool of management, and there was an even more perverse detail. Religion was used as a permanent justification. Priests taught that Africans were descendants of Ham, the cursed son of Noah, and therefore were born to serve. The Bible was distorted to legitimize slavery. Masses were celebrated before ships set sail. The sin was not to enslave. The sin was not converting. And so, the system kept consolidating. From the top, the royalty profited through taxes and concessions. In the middle, merchants got rich from every head sold. At the base, priests blessed and masters whipped. And the enslaved? They lost everything: their name, their land, their language, their dignity, their hope. There were even specific laws to regulate slave ownership. In many Portuguese cities, registrations were made in notary offices as if dealing with livestock. There were price tables based on age, health, sex, and even docility. Young women were worth more as they were forced to work and serve sexually. Strong men were purchased for the fields. Children were raised under the master's authority to learn obedience from an early age. But the system wasn't limited to economic exploitation. It created a culture, an ideology, a world where inequality was naturalized, where skin color defined human value, where violence was a legitimate tool of control. And Portugal exported this vision to every territory it conquered. Over time, other European nations began to copy the Portuguese model. Spain, France, the Netherlands, England, they all drank from the same source. The structure Portugal built, trading posts, routes, ships, methods, laws, religious discourse, was replicated on a global scale. What had been a project became an empire, and the empire was built on black suffering. It's impossible to talk about European modernity, the wealth of colonial empires, or the rise of Atlantic powers without recognizing all of it was financed by African blood, and Portugal, more than a pioneer, was the architect of that system. While others were still fumbling in the dark, Portugal had already mastered the mathematics of pain. It knew how much a body cost, how much a harvest yielded, how much a life was worth. And even after the official end of slavery, its effects would remain for centuries. In names, in land, in families, in scars. If the trade of people in the African trading posts was already cruel, what came next would redefine the very concept of brutality. Because now, Portugal didn't just want to enslave Africans in its territory. It wanted to transport them by the thousands to sustain a new economy in faraway lands under its control. And for that, it created the largest transoceanic human trafficking operation in history. The model established on Africa's coasts, with trading posts, routes, and agreements, was transferred to the South Atlantic. With the discovery and colonization of territories like Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, and eventually Brazil, Portugal saw the opportunity to expand its empire and multiply its profits by using African forced labor. The sugar mills, initially planted on the Atlantic islands, became an experiment. Portugal quickly realized that the success of that production depended on the presence of permanent, submissive, tireless workers. And in the mindset of the time, that meant enslaved Africans. Thus the machinery was formed: capture, transport, sale, production, a cycle that never stopped. With the colonization of Brazil starting in the year 1500, the project scaled to unprecedented proportions. The Portuguese found in this new land a fertile soil and the perfect climate for sugarcane cultivation. But they needed hands, many hands. They first tried to enslave the indigenous peoples, But the impact of European diseases, escape attempts, and cultural resistance made that plan difficult. That's when they looked back to the system they had already mastered, the trafficking of Africans. Thus was born the transatlantic slave trade, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that, for over 3 centuries, would transport more than 4.5 million Africans to Brazil alone. Most came directly from Portuguese trading posts or territories controlled by allies. The death route began deep in the African continent, passed through coastal fortresses, crossed the ocean in dark holds, and ended in ports like Salvador, Recife, and Rio de Janeiro. Portuguese slave ships, known as tumbeiros, were designed to carry as many human beings as possible. Many Africans were chained in pairs, lying side by side, with barely enough room to breathe. Food was scarce, water was rationed, and punishments were constant. Pregnant women, small children, and the elderly received no different treatment. In that space, no one was seen as human. During the crossing, which could last anywhere from 40 to 90 days, it was common for 20 to 30% of captives to die. Their bodies were thrown into the sea, and the waves carried the memory of what history tried to erase. Many Africans chose suicide over slavery. There are records of men and women who threw themselves into the ocean, even in chains, trying to escape what awaited them on the other side of the world. Upon arriving in Brazil, survivors were sold like cattle. There were slave markets in all major cities, and newspaper ads included descriptions of age, physical condition, and behavior. Strong men for cutting sugarcane, women for the kitchen, and the sexual whims of slaveholders, children for domestic labor or to be tamed from a young age. The system was cruel, but profitable, and the more money Portugal made, the more it expanded the trade. Over time, the country formed partnerships with foreign merchants, even from nations that had no colonial control yet. The logic was simple. Portugal sold Africans as international commodities. It was the global distributor of slavery. And we must not forget an essential detail, the legality of it all. The transatlantic trade was backed by laws, contracts, and even religious blessings. The Portuguese state created licensing and regulation systems, issuing specific authorizations for merchants to transport human cargo. The trade was no longer underground. It was an official, taxed, and celebrated business. The structure of the Portuguese Atlantic slave trade was a living organism. Trading posts captured, ships transported, ports unloaded, markets sold, plantations exploited. It was a production line of pain, a mechanism of human gears, fueled by suffering and generating sugar, gold, and status for the European elite. And while Portugal rose as a colonial power, Africans lost everything: their land, their freedom, their names. Many were forced to forget their language, their religion, their history. They were baptized by force, renamed with Portuguese Christian names, and separated from their families to prevent rebellion. The dehumanization was complete. Brazil, in this context, became the largest destination of enslaved Africans in the world. No other country received as many. No other colony was so dependent on that labor. And that dependency created deep roots that still shape social inequality, structural racism, and the silenced memory of an entire people. But it all began with Portugal. It was Portugal that designed this path, tested it, profited from it, and taught others to do the same. The Atlantic trade wasn't an inevitable consequence. It was a deliberate, conscious, and carefully executed choice, made in the name of profit and power. Behind the trade routes, the numbers, and the treaties, there were lives. Men and women who breathed, dreamed, loved. Children who laughed, learned, feared the future. But all of that was interrupted by chains. Portuguese slavery was not just about transport and profit. It brutally reshaped the existence of millions of Africans. It stole their bodies, and their souls. The experience of slavery began long before boarding the ships. Often the capture happened deep in the African interior. Armed men raided villages during the night. They burned homes, kidnapped children, killed anyone who resisted. The captives were tied in rows and forced to march for miles to the coast without food, under scorching sun, in silence. That forced march was called the Death Caravan. Many died before ever seeing the sea. Those who survived were taken to the trading posts, where they spent days confined in fetid dungeons, not knowing what would happen. Some still believed they would be released. Others feared spiritual punishment. Few understood they were about to board a journey with no return, a crossing where the destination was oblivion. In the holds of the slave ships, a new kind of hell began. Africans were forced to lie side by side, packed like puzzle pieces. There was little air, no privacy, and almost no room to move. The dark environment was filled with feces, vomit, blood, and fear. Disease spread like wildfire. Scurvy, dysentery, smallpox. Death was a constant shadow, and even those who didn't die, died a little inside. Women, in particular, suffered in even deeper layers. Many were raped during the crossing by sailors and captains. They became temporary concubines in the lower decks, used by force, humiliated in silence. Some became pregnant aboard. Others lost their babies during the voyage. The crossing was a tomb of bodies and a massacre of dignity. Upon arrival in the colonies, the survivors were taken to slave markets. They were washed with vinegar, rubbed with oil to appear healthier, and exhibited in plazas as fresh merchandise. They received new names: Portuguese, Catholic, civilized. They were branded with hot irons, like cattle. Each mark indicated the owner, the year, the origin. It was the baptism of oblivion. Life in captivity was defined by relentless labor, daily punishment, and constant surveillance. In Brazil's sugar plantations, men worked from sunup to sundown, cutting cane, hauling millstones, transporting barrels. Women were forced to cook, clean, care for the master's children, and at night, satisfy their desires. There was no rest, no choice. Children were born into captivity and ripped from their mothers early. Some were sold to other farms. Others were forced to watch their parents' punishments as a lesson. They grew up never knowing what freedom meant, never knowing their African names, never knowing their ancestry. It was a generation built to forget. Punishments were a pedagogy of fear. The enslaved who fled, who answered back, who dared to defy, were whipped. They received 100, 200, even 300 lashes. Torture posts stood in the open as a permanent reminder. There were also mutilations, ears cut off, fingers amputated, bodies hung in public. It was necessary, they believed, to teach that resistance had a price. And yet, there was resistance. And this must be said with force. Enslaved Africans did not passively accept their condition. There were escapes, there were rebellions, there were Quilombo communities, there were secret songs, preserved languages, hidden rituals. There was strength, there was faith. In many cases, the enslaved created solidarity networks. They shared food, protected the sick, hid escapees. In the terreiros, they kept African spirituality alive, even under the threat of the Inquisition. In their dances, they preserved memories of their homeland. In whispered names at night, they remembered their ancestors. Slavery tried to erase, but could not silence everything. Still, the suffering was daily. The plantation masters wielded absolute power. Many saw themselves as gods. They decided who was beaten, who died, who lived. They used the church pulpit and legal codes to justify their violence, and even when a slave was freed, they were rarely truly free. They remained poor, landless, rightless, at the mercy of a society that saw them as former slaves, never as equals. Portuguese colonial society built a racial logic that would endure for centuries. Skin color came to define a person's worth. African features became synonymous with inferiority. Inequality was written into the streets, the surnames, the politics, the religion. The enslaved were seen as less than human, and that idea poisoned generations. And the cruelest part of all, the enslaved themselves knew it. Many left letters, accounts, poems, prayers. Some secretly learned to read and recorded their pain. Others passed their stories on orally so that their children would know where they came from. They wanted to be remembered. They knew that forgetting was the final death. Life under Portuguese rule was a silent battlefield, a war for survival, for memory, for identity. Millions died without names. Thousands resisted with their bodies. Hundreds left traces. And each one of them is part of a story that still pulses, though muffled by textbooks and omission. Today, when we walk the streets of Lisbon, Rio de Janeiro, or Luanda, we must ask ourselves, how many of these stones were laid by chained hands? How many of these plazas were washed with blood? How many of these monuments celebrate those who held the whip but ignore those who bled? The lives of those enslaved under Portuguese rule reflect the worst humanity can offer, but also the greatest resistance it can muster. Lisbon is a stunning city. Cobblestone streets, yellow trams, charming lookout points. But behind the colorful facades and monuments to the navigators lies an absent memory, a silenced history. Portugal was the first European country to enslave Africans on a large scale, yet walks the sidewalks of the present as if it has forgotten. In schools, history books glorify the age of discovery, the great navigations, the genius of the Portuguese at sea. And they teach the exploits of Vasco da Gama, Pedro Álvares Cabral, Ferdinand Magellan. But they rarely mention the slave ship holds, the fortified African trading posts, or the slave markets in Lisbon. Slavery is treated as a footnote, as if it were a mistake, a detail, and not the foundation of an empire. For centuries, Portugal took pride in being a maritime empire, a small country that conquered territories on 4 continents, a nation that spread its language, its religion, and its culture, but it never fully took responsibility for the violence that made it possible. And even today, that silence echoes in every corner. Walking through Lisbon's historic center is to walk among tributes to colonizers, statues of kings, busts of navigators, street names honoring the heroes of overseas expansion. But where are the monuments to the victims? Where is the recognition for those who died so those empires could flourish? The truth is, in Portugal's symbolic landscape, the enslaved have no face. Even in museums, slavery is often addressed superficially. There are exhibitions about the discoveries, the caravels, the sea routes, but rarely about the bodies forced aboard, the punishments on the plantations, the muffled screams below deck. And when they do appear, it's with softened terms, forced labor, Atlantic trade, colonial relations. Pain is sanitized. Horror is translated into euphemisms. In recent years, social movements have begun to demand change. Black intellectuals, activists, descendants of Africans are calling for memory, justice, and representation. There is growing pressure for a national museum of slavery, for changes in school curricula, for public recognition of the past. But the responses from the Portuguese state have been timid, slow, often symbolic and insufficient for the size of the wound. In the year 2017, President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa acknowledged in a speech that Portugal was a pioneer in the slave trade and must face this past with courage. It was an important gesture, but not enough. Recognition is the first step. Reparation is the second, and the third, and hardest, is transforming collective consciousness. Because historical silence is not just omission, it perpetuates inequality. Today, Portugal has a significant Afro-descendant population, many from former African colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé, and Príncipe. But these communities face structural racism, social exclusion, and persistent invisibility. In the marginalized neighborhoods of Lisbon and Porto, it's common to see black youth discriminated against. Public schools marked by inequality, opportunities systematically denied. The past hasn't passed. It breathes in the statistics, in sideways glances, in denied jobs, in targeted policing. Meanwhile, national pride continues to be fed by romanticized images of the past. Caravels are still symbols of glory. Colonization is depicted as civilization. And slavery, when mentioned, is still described as something everyone did back then. A way to dilute guilt, to spread responsibility, to avoid confronting the mirror. But some mirrors can no longer be ignored. In the digital age, where information spreads rapidly, new generations are beginning to ask questions. Young Portuguese want to know what they weren't told in school. They want to understand why their black classmates live such different realities. They increasingly want a history without edits. And that's where hope lies. Silence can last for centuries, but all it takes is one voice to break it. Just one video, one book, one documentary, one critical class can crack the walls of denial. Portugal cannot erase the past, but it can and must rewrite it with truth, responsibility, and empathy. Slavery is not just an African tragedy, not just a Brazilian stain. It is also deeply a European wound. And Portugal, as the pioneer of that system, has a moral duty to be a pioneer in memory, in reparation, and in historical justice. To admit is not to be ashamed of the homeland. It is to honor those it silenced. It is to tell future generations that glory cannot be built on suffering, that wealth built on pain is a curse, not a legacy, and that a country is only truly great when it has the courage to face its ghosts. What began with small ships touching the African coast soon became a blueprint for planetary domination. Portugal not only took the first step, it taught the way, drew the map, and showed the world how to profit from pain. It was the laboratory of Atlantic slavery, and its project was exported as a commodity of prestige. When the Spanish, Dutch, English, and French entered the game of colonization, there was already a manual ready. The trading posts, the modified ships, the agreements with local chiefs, the techniques for domesticating captives, the surveillance and punishment methods, Portugal had already tested, corrected, and refined it all. It's no coincidence that the major trade routes of the 16th century onward were built upon paths opened by the Portuguese. The triangular trade model, for example. Europe provided weapons and textiles, Africa provided people, the Americas provided agricultural goods, was born from the Portuguese experience. The logic was simple. 3 continents, 1 fuel, the enslaved black body. And it wasn't just commerce that went global, so did the ideology. Modern racism, as a system of hierarchy based on skin color, gained strength and legitimacy through the slavery practiced by Portugal. Before that, slavery had more to do with religion, war, or social status. With the Portuguese, it became racialized, hereditary, and perpetual. That idea that Africans were naturally inferior, born to serve and animalized by European culture, was taught, repeated, printed, and institutionalized, and over time it became the norm. The entire world began to operate under this logic. Skin color became a border, a justification, a sentence. The consequence, a global system of production and consumption built on the dehumanization of an entire continent. European kingdoms flourished through African exploitation. Cities like London, Bordeaux, Amsterdam, and Lisbon were paved with gold and blood. Modern capitalism was fed by slavery. Family fortunes, banks, universities, insurance companies, all profited from the trade of human lives. And that impact didn't end with abolition. On the contrary, abolition only marked the end of physical chains. Prejudice, inequality, exclusion, and symbolic violence continued and still continue. The post-slavery world is, in many ways, a direct heir of the Portuguese world of slavery. The Americas are the clearest example. Brazil, the United States, Colombia, Cuba, Haiti, all these countries bear open scars. Where there was trafficking, there is racism. Where there was exploitation, there is poverty. Where there was domination, there is a broken memory. And in all of these places, the seed was planted by Portugal. And perhaps the most devastating impact was spiritual. Millions of people grew up not knowing where they came from. Languages were lost. Gods were erased. Cultures were ridiculed. Portuguese slavery didn't just destroy lives, it reconstructed the world on the lie of white superiority. Today, when we look at the map of inequality, we see the reflection of the slave trade. When we analyze who lives in the poorest neighborhoods, who is most frequently stopped by police, who has less access to healthcare and education, we are seeing the echoes of a project started more than 5 centuries ago. Portugal started this process, but its influence spread like black ink across white paper, invisible to those who refuse to see, but impossible to erase for those who feel it on their skin. The true impact of the Portuguese model of slavery is not only in the past. It shaped the present, and it continues to shape the future every time we choose silence over justice. Portugal was the first, not by accident, not by ignorance, but by choice. It chose to turn the sea into a route for profit and human beings into merchandise. It chose to build an empire with the hands of others. It chose to forget and to teach the world to forget with it. But what history tried to bury, truth insists on resurrecting. For centuries, black bodies were sold, branded, violated. But their memories were never erased. They live on in reinvented names, in the drums that crossed oceans, in the eyes of those who still resist. Each ship that left the African coast carried more than captives. It carried voices that time could not silence. Now that you know, you cannot unknow. This video isn't just about Portugal. It's about the world. It's about the price of silence. It's about the cost of not teaching. It's about how the glory of an empire was built on the cries of mothers, the blood of children, the sweat of chained men. It's about the responsibility of those who inherit this past, even if not guilty, never without consequence. If this touched you, share it. Make this story echo where it was once silenced. Show that memory is a form of justice, and that true freedom begins when we have the courage to tell the truth. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and help us continue unearthing the stories they tried to hide from us, because the past cannot be changed, but the future can still be written with consciousness.